Welcome to Unit 2 of Texas Government. In this unit, we are going to be taking a step backwards and talking about some things that happened in history and kind of how our history has shaped our current Texas government and kind of how the government of Texas has progressed through the years. So we are going to touch on some history. This is not a history class, I understand that, but it does help us to see kind of where we ended up or how we ended up where we are today. So the first thing we're going to talk about, and I should have warned you, this is a combo of the first two topics that are listed on Unit 2 of the syllabus. And so we're going to talk about Texas political roots and then straight into Texas diversity and political culture. So this is one PowerPoint, one lecture, two different topics are going to be covered. So you'll see that Unit 2 is actually a pretty quick unit, but I feel like Unit 1 was a little bit of a heavy unit. So, so this is going to kind of give you a little bit of a chance to catch up. So let's talk about Texas's political roots. Again, like I said, it helps if we get a little bit of history, remind ourselves what Texas was like, right after we won our independence from Mexico, and then how we've gotten to where we are today. So, remember what happened in 1836. The Texas Revolution has ended. The winners of the revolution were Sam Houston, Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie, and they were all Anglo, Scotch-Irish descent. Remember, when I say winners, the reason I put that in quotes is that history is told by the winners. And so we sound like we were victorious by defeating the Mexican troops and the Mexican army, but at the same time, I think that Mexico would tell a much different story. And also, I'm not 100% sure that there are ever winners in a war, but that's just an aside. But the reason I put it in quotes, the winners of the Texas Revolution, the people that were the heroes of the Alamo, the heroes of the Texas Revolution, Sam Houston, Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie. All of these are white guys, is the point. So as these people who were victorious became more prolific, the Anglo population grew to be the majority in Texas. So it was, we won our independence from Mexico and then really started making Texas a lot wider and a lot less influenced by Mexico, who we just broke off from. There's also manifest destiny going on right here, which increased the Anglo population and decreased the indigenous or the Mexican population. If you're not familiar with manifest destiny, that is just the thought that Americans are justified in whatever they do to the people who are originally on the land. The Americans are justified in getting rid of those people and expanding the United States or the American culture throughout North America. So basically, manifest destiny let people not feel bad for taking land away from people who originally owned it. So that's where we are in 1836. Now, from 1836 to 1845, Texas is free of Mexico. We're our own little entity, but we are not able to join the United States until 1845, because during this time, there's the build up to, the scuttlebutt, the build up to the Civil War. People are starting to question slavery, and when new states are admitted to the United States, there is a lot of discussion about we'll admit one free state for one slave state. So even though only 5% of Texans at this time owned slaves, we were still seen as a slave state because we were in the South and we were okay with slavery. We didn't think everybody had to have a slave, but we also were not going to tell any of the other southern states that they needed to get rid of their slaves. So because of the politics, even though Texas voted to join the United States in 1836, we didn't really become a state until 1845. So when we celebrate, the birth of Texas as a state, it is 1845. The Articles of Annexation that were, negotiated to allow Texas to become part of the United States let Texas keep all of our public lands, which was kind of interesting. That's not something that every state was able to do. Texas was able to do it because it was a trade-off. We had a lot of debt because we had just fought a war, and when you finish fighting a war, you're left with a lot of debt. And so the United States said, we're not going to take your debt, but we'll let you keep your public lands. So there's lots of ways that Texas is a little bit different from other states in the United States, and this is one of them, is that we kept our own public lands. We also are different because we have the power to create 4 new states on our own. So we have the option of breaking up our giant state into 4 smaller states within Texas if we wanted to. So nobody's ever done that, but we do have that option. So 1846, we are in the United States as a state, and there are factions growing. There's the pro-Sam Houston, and then who are the Unionists, saying that we need to stick with the United States no matter what happens. There's, all this talk of the Civil War bubbling throughout the United States. Sam Houston says, we need to stick with the United States. We don't need to secede. We don't need to join the Confederacy. And then Lamar ran the secessionists. And so the other faction that believed that, yes, Texas does need to break free from the United States. We will join the Confederacy with the rest of, the southern states. And so Sam Houston tried to broker a deal saying that why don't we just stay as a republic? We could just be the Republic of Texas. That way we're not going with the Confederacy. We're also not fighting on the side of the Union. We're just going to be, kind of our own thing. We, like I said, only 5% of Texans own slaves. And so that means that while we weren't opposed to slavery during this time, it wasn't something that we felt so strongly about that we wanted to join the Confederacy and make sure that slavery was protected. So Sam Houston says, hey, why don't we just do, just kind of remain on our own. We could be a republic instead. That was not accepted, and the secessionists decided that they were going to take over. They, had an election. It was, when I talk about voter fraud, there was a lot of declaring, votes illegal and things like that. And when Lincoln became president in 1860, the secessionists were able to take over the government, get Sam Houston out, and secede. And then we all know the Civil War came right after that. So, Civil War ends in April of 1865. And so let's talk about the post-Civil War time. June 19th, 1865 is Juneteenth. I really hope that everybody knows that Juneteenth is a celebration of people who were formerly slaves being notified that they were no longer slaves. And so when you hear Juneteenth celebrations, if you don't know what that is, that's what it is. So June 19th, 1865. During this time, federal troops came in and occupied Texas to restore order. That was something that was happening all over the South. The North, rightly so, I'm sure, was reluctant to just let the South take care of abolishing slavery on their own, and so really moved in to make sure that slavery was abolished. African Americans were given the right to vote in 1869, and at the same time, people who were in the military and who were Confederate officers were denied the right to vote, again, because that was, a punishment and a way to keep those people from gaining power again. And then when Texas was readmitted to the United States during this time, civilian authority could finally resume because Texas was a state again. In 1869, from about 1869 to 1886, there were some economic problems in Texas because we had a strong centralized government. We had a strong, Texas government. We wanted to have a lot of reforms to make Texas a better state, but also to adjust to no longer having slaves. There was a decrease in our tax base because before, property taxes were paid on the number of slaves you owned. So if you owned a lot of slaves, you paid a lot of property taxes. Well, when slaves were no longer considered property, then your property taxes went down. You no longer had that property that you were paying taxes on to, the Texas state government. So we had, we're trying to spend more money to create some reform, but at the same time we're losing money because the people that paid taxes on slaves no longer are paying those taxes. And so economic trouble. In 1873, we allowed the former Confederates to regain their right to vote. So their punishment period was over, and that led to a shift in political power. In 1876, we had a new constitution. So you can kind of see how this, this time period is evolving and how our Constitution that we will talk about at length in the next unit is, kind of the events leading up to the new Texas Constitution. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the governors in Texas, the early governors in Texas, after this period of time, and kind of this, post Civil War, the 1890s on, governors, because it really kind of lets you know what was important at the time in Texas and how voters were reacting. So we have the era of the two Jims. First of all, we have Jim Hogg, who was, ran and was elected as champion of the common people. He wanted to regulate railroads, bust up monopolies, regulate insurance companies, and get rid of child labor. He started the Railroad Commission, which you probably see on your ballot and think, why is this such a big deal? Why do we care so much about the Railroad Commission? But it was started to regulate railroads, but also trucks and the production of oil and natural gas. So that's a kind of a big deal in Texas. It's not just, trying to make sure that railroads are being safe when they're running through the state. Now, he was, there's a lot of kind of lore about Jim Hogg. Some people said he had two daughters, one named Ima and one named Ura, so like I'm a hog and you're a hog. The first part of that is right, that he did have a daughter named Ima Hogg, but he did not have a daughter named Ura Hogg. So after he served from 1891 to 1895, there were some, kind of unremarkable governors until 1914, when Farmer Jim Ferguson, who's also known as Pa Ferguson, was elected. And Pa Ferguson was in favor of assisting tenant farmers, improving public education. He wanted to reform state courts and regulate big business. One of the things that he accomplished was he established the State Highway Commission that constructed roads throughout the state. And the reason they did that is because it was more consistent to have a statewide commission in charge of the roads than it was to just leave it up to each county to try to take care of their own roads. It would just make the roads nicer and make the roads to a higher standard. So that was something that he was able to accomplish. He also waged war with the University of Texas, because the University of Texas Board of Regents was appointing people and hiring professors that he found objectionable. And so because he, was trying to punish the University of Texas any way he could, and was very openly not in favor of the University of Texas, he was also not favored by those in power and those who were connected to the university, which is right there in his capital in Austin. He was actually impeached in 1918 and barred from holding public office because there were rumors of financial irregularities within his campaign, within his administration. So after he is impeached, there is a time of between 1918 and 1924. That is when we are facing World War I. We have Germany, who sends the Zimmerman Note to Mexico, asking Mexico to invade Texas. So the federal government comes into Texas to use Texas as a military training area. So we've got, kind of a lot of those tensions going on. We have a significant increase in power of the KKK, and they were, and also were facing prohibition. So, a lot's going on. So he's impeached in 1918. Things kind of go crazy after that. In 1924, his wife, Ma Ferguson, ran for governor, and she ran on the platform that you would get 2 governors for the price of 1. So not at all hiding the fact that she was going to have her husband, who, although prohibited from holding state office because he'd been impeached, was going to be very involved in the running of the state. So she won in 1924, our first female governor, but a lot of times people put an asterisk beside that because there was a lot of discussion about whether or not she was really acting as the governor of Texas, or was she just more of a figurehead. And he was actually calling all the shots from behind the scenes. Ma Ferguson was strongly anti-KKK, and she was successful in getting wearing a mask in public prohibited, so that basically if the Klan wanted to be involved in politics, they had to remove their hoods and remove their masks and show everybody who they were. Now, I think that's a little bit interesting that she was able to get wearing a mask in public prohibited, and now we are all wearing masks in public. So, as Ma Ferguson went through a couple of different administrations, she was reelected and saw the end of Prohibition, the increase in, or the allowance of a local option to sell liquor, which is why sometimes if you live in some city, you won't have any liquor stores in Texas, but the next city over may have liquor stores, things like that. And she was reelected during the Great Depression for her second term. So let's talk about post-World War II to today. This is where we get into Texas changing from an always blue state, a Democratic state, to a Republican state. So Texas was a Democratic state until 1979, when Bill Clements was the first Republican governor, and he was the first Republican to be elected to the governorship since the 1870s. Texas favored Eisenhower, who was a Republican, in 1952, and that was kind of the beginning of Texas dipping their toe into, maybe we'll be in favor of some Republican candidates nationwide. The reason Texas got behind Eisenhower was because of Tidelands issues. And what Tidelands issues were is, as you know, Texas is bordering the Gulf of Mexico. And in the Gulf of Mexico, there is oil. And so Texas wanted to be able to access all of the land from the coast out 10 miles, and that be Texas land, because that would mean that Texas was in charge and owned all of the oil that was within those first 10 miles. The Tidelands legislation, the federal government legislation, wanted to have rights to the oil after just 3 miles. So Texas would only extend 3 miles from the coast. So that would give, we're basically losing out on 7 miles of land that would have, oil, we could produce oil from it. Because Eisenhower supported the 10-mile versus the 3-mile Tideland issue, Texas got behind Dwight Eisenhower, and he was able to win in 1952 as a Republican. So this is after Eisenhower, we, finally decided that in Texas it was okay to vote Republican, and even conservative Democrats supported Bill Clements when he was elected in 1979. Now, after Clements' first term, though, Mark White was elected in 1982 because he promised teacher salary increases. So he beat Bill Clements in 1982 and was a Democrat. So we had, this one little Republican and, the first Republican in history to be a governor, or in recent history, and then right back to the Democrats. But because arguably Mark White did not deliver as much on his teacher salary increase promises, Clements was elected again in 1986, and then at the same time that Clements was elected in 1986, the Supreme Court that was elected in Texas was also Republican, and the Railroad Commissioner was Republican too. Now remember, Railroad Commissioner, back to the days of Jim Hogg, that's not just in charge of the railroad. The Railroad Commissioner was in charge of the oil and the gas. So that's a big deal. It's a big position in Texas. So finally, Texas is starting to go more Republican at the statewide level. In 1990, Ann Richards was elected governor. She was a Democrat, and when I said there was an asterisk beside Ma Ferguson as the first Texas governor who was female, Ann Richards was a full-on, first female governor of Texas with no asterisk. She did not have somebody else calling the shots in her household. But at the same time she's elected, we have Kay Bailey Hutchison and Phil Gramm, who are both Republicans, as senators. So we have a Democratic governor, but our senators are both Republican. And then finally, George W. Bush, is elected as a Republican governor in 1994, and since then, a Democrat has not held a statewide office in Texas. So since 1994, everybody has been a Republican, and frankly, as we talked about in the last lecture, most of the post-Jimmy Carter, all of the post-Jimmy Carter presidential candidates who were Republicans had all of the support of Texas. So that takes us to the end of the first part of this lecture and the beginning of the second part of the lecture, which just talks about Texas political culture and diversity. So what is political culture? When somebody says, what is the political culture of Texas? If somebody's never been to Texas before and they ask you that, what is the political culture? What they're really asking is, how do people feel about the government? What do they think about how much government, how much power the government should have, or services it should provide? How much should people be able to influence the government's actions, and how much should the government influence the electorates, the people's actions in the state? It is shaped by our ideology, our cultural regions, and our treatment of minority groups. That's what shapes our political culture in Texas. And we're going to talk about all of those things just kind of one by one. Our political culture is influenced by our thoughts about political culture are influenced by our family, our education, our peers, our religion. Lots of things go into our beliefs about how much power the government should have and what kind of influence it should have over the people. Now, political ideology is different from political culture and different from party. So we've talked about a little bit before, a political party is a Democrat or a Republican or the Green Party or the Libertarian Party. But ideology is conservative or liberal. So the conservative ideology believes that there should be few business regulations. It's okay for business to have incentives like tax breaks, things like that, but very little government involvement in business. Limited government involvement in taxation, economic regulation. This is where we get to the free market approach, where let's just let the market take care of itself. Conservative ideology believes in very limited government involvement in social services, and like I said, very few business regulations. Free market capitalism is just the belief that we let the market take care of itself. So the market will correct itself. Instead of the government having to come in and hand out assistance to people or assistance to businesses, let's just let the market correct itself. Conservative ideology is aligned with traditional values and lifestyles, and so that when we say traditional values and lifestyles, historically it has been pro-marriage and pro-life, as saying, defining marriage as one man and one woman, and also defining pro-life as life beginning at conception, meaning abortion is the taking of a human life and thus should be considered illegal, just like murder is illegal. And conservatives are cautious in response to social change. So they are going to be later to get on the bandwagon when there is social change. Like we can just take LGBTQ rights. There's going to be, they're going to be slower to want to expand those rights, slower to embrace casino gambling or marijuana, medical marijuana or legalized marijuana. Now, a liberal ideology wants to increase the role of government in trying to improve the welfare of individuals. So arguably at the expense of government, expense of business, wants to make sure that money and resources are shifted from those who have a lot to those who don't have a lot, so that the welfare of individuals can be improved. The liberal ideology is in favor of civil rights and the expansion of civil rights, very tolerant of social change. So they will be first on the bandwagon to have marijuana legalized or casino gambling introduced into the state. And the liberal ideology is in favor of government regulation of the economy and businesses, again, to make sure that businesses are not too powerful and are not taking too much of the resource pool that individuals can't have it. The liberal ideology thinks that the government needs to step in and make sure there's not an imbalance of power in businesses, and so does not favor just let the market take care of itself and sort itself out. The liberal ideology would like the government to step in and make sure that there is a balance in the economy. So how do Texans identify and really we have to say, how do Texans traditionally identify? Because these numbers are based on, history in the last 20, 30 years, and we can't, we're not sure if history is changing right now, but traditionally, Texans identify as conservative. More Texans identify as conservative. You can see about 48% of Texans self-identify as conservative overall, but when you break it down to gender, most men identify as conservative, and majority of, the biggest slice of the pie for women is that they identify as conservative, but it's a little bit more equal, and it's not over 50%. When you look at different ethnic or racial groups, most Anglos identify as conservative, but again, when you look at Latino or African American, there's a big chunk of those groups who self-identify as moderate instead of, all liberal or all conservative. When you look on a generational level, as the generations age, as the people in the generations age, more and more they identify as conservative. So when you look at millennials, moderate or kind of independent is the prevailing belief. But as you move forward to Gen X, to the baby boomers, to the silent generation, you see that little red piece of the pie showing the conservative ideology increases. So by the time you get to people your grandparents' age, you have a big chunk of most of them identifying as conservative. Now, when we look at counties in Texas, these are the biggest counties in Texas, and kind of how they identify as liberal versus conservative. So you'll see the most liberal county is Travis County, which is where University of Texas is. It is in Austin. It is a big college town, and college towns and colleges are very heavily liberal for the most part. And then as you move up, El Paso, Nueces County, which is Corpus Christi, Dallas, Harris, which is Texas, and then Bexar County, Tarrant County, As we said, Bexar County is in San Antonio, Tarrant County is Fort Worth. You move up, and those are kind of moderately liberal counties. Now, Bell County is just right near Waco, and when you move up from there, these next group of counties are still moderate, but more on the moderately conservative end of the spectrum. So Fort Bend, which is down kind of at the near El Paso, I would say. It's really hard to express that without being able to point to a map or to use my hands to show you where it is in Texas. But Denton County, as you probably know, is north of Dallas. Jefferson County is down by Beaumont. Galveston, McLennan County, again, McLennan is in the Waco area. Lubbock, which is West Texas. And then the most conservative county is Brazoria County, which is down near Houston. It is, in Angleton, Texas. It is the home of a lot of oil refineries. Many of the big oil refineries in Texas are in Brazoria County. So when we talk about, remember that party is different than ideology. So ideology is your idea, your thoughts. Are you conservative or are you liberal? Your party is Republican, Democrat, Independent. So a lot of times the party and the ideology match up. So conservative is Republican, liberal is Democrat, but not always. When you look at voters, when you look at all voters in Texas, more voters identify as Republican than identify as Democrat. And let's just say, again, this is historically, this is not anything that happened in the 2020 election. We're not going to be able to include that in this discussion yet, because it's not quite yet in the history books. More men identify as Republicans, women identify as Democrats. African American, Anglo, Latino, you can see where those groups traditionally fall as far as Republican versus Democrat. And then let's look at the generations. Again, as the generations get older, they get more conservative. They get more, a bigger chunk of them are identifying with the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party. So when we talk about ideology, conservative versus liberal, where do we see the effects of that kind of in our day-to-day life? Where do you and I see the effect of Texas's conservative ideology as compared to other states that have more liberal ideologies? For one thing, Texas has a lower tax rate than other states. If you've lived in states like California, where there is a more liberal ideology, more prevalent liberal ideology in the people and the elected officials, there's a lot higher tax burden put on those people in California. There are fewer state resources devoted to public services in Texas than there are in more liberal states. So more liberal states like New York or California have greater access to public transportation, for example. So there are a lot of state resources devoted to public transportation there. There's a lot of state resources devoted to public assistance programs in those states. Fewer state resources in Texas devoted to that. And then in Texas, you will see the conservative views as like the conservative social views enforced by state law. So basically the people that have conservative views who are elected have influence in passing laws that line up with their conservative ideology. So things like there's a ban on casino gambling. That's why we have so many casinos in Oklahoma, or just right across the border in Louisiana. The conservative social values want to keep casino gambling out of Texas because they want to keep the kind of the Las Vegas lifestyle, the lots of drinking alcohol, lots of gambling, the kind of criminal element that is thought to accompany casinos out of Texas. The medical marijuana is very difficult to obtain in Texas as compared to other states. You know, for example, Colorado, much more liberal ideology, and most of the people that live in Colorado, super easy to get marijuana there, not super easy to get it here in Texas. And restricting abortion rights. So Texas has had a long history of conservative lawmakers making laws that restrict the ability of a woman to obtain an abortion or a legal abortion. And so that is just an expansion of the conservative ideology. We're going to talk more about that at a later class. So let's talk about the cultural regions in Texas. You'll be able to see on this map kind of what different regions there are in Texas, and kind of how those, you'll be able to see how those regions line up with the maps that showed, you know, where were there more Republicans and Democrats, and you'll be able to see that there is an overlap there. So let's start in East Texas. So that's that kind of off-white part with Longview, Tyler, Lufkin right there on the border of Louisiana. East Texas is kind of the old South, the rural, meaning you know, most people don't live in a city, even if you live in Tyler or Longview or Lufkin, that's not, you know, a city with skyscrapers kind of a city. They're biracial, which just means that the races, there are a lot of African Americans and a lot of white people, and there's not a whole lot of intermingling between the two races. There's, in these cities, there's a lot of the other side of the tracks, or, you know, different parts of town where different people of different races live. There are a lot of old families, like old family money. So the wealth is in real estate, banking, construction, things like that. Very big Protestant. Lots of, I would say, lots of Baptists, and you know, lots of Protestant conservative voters in East Texas. Okay, next we'll go down a little bit to the Gulf Coast, and that is the kind of the dark blue, where there's Port Arthur, Orange, Beaumont, Houston's right there on the edge, but Galveston, Lake Jackson, Victoria, right, you know, on the edge of Corpus Christi. So that whole area down there on the coast is very conservative. Their wealth is from oil, obviously. They're right there on the edge where, you know, they're going out 10 miles to drill in the Gulf. They have a lot of wealth from shipping, construction, land development, energy. Lots of corporate headquarters are down in that area. There's also lots of immigration down in that area. Very conservative group right on the edge. Now, we have said that Houston is a more liberal county. And as you can see, Houston is just right there, kind of on the border of the Gulf Coast and Central Texas. So let's move on down more to South Texas, which is the kind of brown taupe. I don't know what color that is, but it includes, you know, includes like Crystal City, Laredo, the Valley, things like that. South Texas has a lot of migrant workers, as you can imagine. It's our nice warm part of Texas where there is, you know, farming, and there are a lot of cultures that are based in either Spanish or Native American heritage. Big citrus and vegetable producing region. And then if you go right on the edge of that, where you see Del Rio and Laredo, Rio Grande City, and McAllen and Brownsville, that's all the Texas border. It's biracial, bicultural, bilingual, binational. It benefits from the United States businesses that have factories in Mexico. All the places, in that area of Texas are, really on the border, but really heavily influenced by, their Mexican heritage, and a lot of things in that region are bilingual and bicultural. Going up to kind of the El Paso, the red area, is far west Texas, and that is really a big livestock area. It's an area El Paso really benefited from NAFTA when it was in place, the North American Free Trade Agreement, because it allowed, passage to Mexico easily, and big benefits to companies that were United States companies that had factories and different operations in Juarez, which is right across the border from El Paso. Now, if we move over a little bit to the kind of blue area, blue-green area that doesn't have any cities in it, you'll see that's the German Hill Country. If you've ever been out there, it's beautiful. Lots of wineries now. It's got a lot of Czech and Polish, Norwegian immigrant populations. They are socially and politically conservative. There's farming and ranching, and like I said, the wineries are out there. Going kind of up from that to the orange area, that's West Texas. So when people talk about they lived out in West Texas for a while, that's, Lubbock, Wichita Falls, Midland, Odessa, San Angelo. That is West Texas. It is wide open spaces, Bible Belt fundamentalism. Most of the people who live out there are white. There are some Hispanic people that live there, but big white populations. Lots of cotton, grain, feedlots for cattle, sheep, wool, things like that. And again, just wide open spaces out in West Texas. In the Panhandle, up in the green, Amarillo, that is a lot of railroad. There's, a lot of I-40 runs through Amarillo, and I-40 is old Route 66, which goes coast to coast. There's railroad up there, there's cotton and grain and cattle, and again, a lot of wide open spaces. And finally, that takes us over to, well, not finally, but it takes us over to North Texas, which is where we are in Dallas and Fort Worth. We are kind of the banking and commercial center of Texas. We are, we like to tout ourselves as the kind of national and international gateway to other places and to Texas, kind of the cosmopolitan, economically diverse, but also racially diverse part of Texas. And then finally is Central Texas, which is just the, Austin, San Antonio, Brenham, Killeen, that whole area of Texas. It is, even though Killeen, and there are the military bases there, it is a very liberal part of Texas. It's the Silicon Valley of Texas. Austin had South by Southwest in years that we're not having a global pandemic. Universities, lots of universities in that area, and very liberal ideology there. So how does Texas embrace its diversity? So we talked about how, there's Bible Belt fundamentalists, there are people who are bicultural, so we've got two different cultures at play. We've got people who are from German heritage, Czech heritage. We have, our cosmopolitan groups, and how does that all kind of work together in Texas? Well, the laws in Texas are historically written by white guys. So as you'll see when we go through our Constitution, a lot of the laws benefit white males. And so, we had a difficult time in Texas integrating our schools. We have, had a difficult time getting voting law right and being able to have safe voting laws that are not also racially discriminatory. And something I want you to think about, more of a rhetorical question, is think about how minority groups have fared through Texas's history. How have people with different heritage, Native American heritage, Mexican American heritage fared? We talked about earlier through, Manifest Destiny, when the white guys won at the Alamo, they had no problem pushing people who were not like them, not Anglo, off their lands. And so I would say, historically, minority groups haven't fared so great in Texas throughout the history, but we'd have to really think about how minority groups are faring today in Texas's history. For many years at the beginning of, like the 2010 era, that decade, I was pretty boastful of how Texas was really great at not having racial police shootings, and we didn't have racial issues anymore where people were being targeted because they had different color skin, and that really setting aside things that still happen in Deep East Texas and in those areas, really it sounded like, well, in Dallas, we don't really have the same problems you guys have in Chicago or New York City or, St. Louis, things like that. I'm not sure that we can still boast that. In fact, I'm pretty sure we can't still boast that. But I want you to think about how minority groups have fared throughout Texas's history, and then also how are minority groups faring today? What is your thought about that? What is your view on that? Let's look at the treatment of women throughout history. There is a long history of giving women property rights. In Texas, we have community property. That means that if you are married, that you own the property with as much right as your spouse. So the legal term is you have an undivided 1/2 interest in your property, which means I don't own, the right side of my house. My husband owns the left side of my house. We both own half of all of the house. And so because of our Spanish heritage, women have fared pretty well in Texas. Women had the right to vote in the 1918 Texas primary. We were the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment in 1920. So we were way ahead of the curve on letting women vote. We had Ma Ferguson, who was a governor. Even if she came with an asterisk, she was a governor of Texas. She was the second woman to be a governor in all of the United States. Women were allowed to serve on juries starting in 1954. We actually approved the Equal Rights Amendment in 1972. There is a Marital Property Act in 1972 that really expanded the rights of women in, when women were divorced. Roe versus Wade in 1973 was a decision from Texas and involved Texas plaintiff and Texas defendant, and it had huge influence on the United States and setting the course of allowing women to have more of a say-so over whether or not they were allowed to have an abortion. And then Hellerstedt is a law. It was a case in Texas that dealt with an unconstitutional law, was later found unconstitutional, that required abortion clinics to maintain the same standards as surgery centers, and doctors had to have admitting privileges, and it worked to, the law worked to make abortions basically unable to be obtained, and women would not be able to find somewhere to perform an abortion, to obtain an abortion. And the Hellerstedt case held the Texas law unconstitutional and restored women's rights. Now, so there's a lot of great that has happened throughout Texas's history with women. It's not always been rosy. For a long time, a woman could not, if a woman was married, she could not be hired for a job without getting the consent of her husband. The wife could only obtain a divorce if her husband lived in adultery with another woman, or the physical violence was such that there was a serious danger it would happen again. It was, a man would not be punished for being physically violent to his wife if he could say that the wife provoked him. A man could get a divorce if his wife had an amorous or lascivious conduct with another man. So you see the disparity there in the standards of obtaining a divorce. Basically, a man had to have moved out and moved in with another woman, but if a woman had amorous or lascivious conduct with another guy, then a man could divorce her. The right to vote for women was fought for by Jim Ferguson, but it was also really, the fight was led by William Hobby. And if you've ever been to Houston, you may have flown through Hobby Airport, named after him. So that is, you know, Texas has been kind of on the forefront, really on the forefront of increasing women's rights. Now let's talk about treatment of African Americans. We had some problems getting the voting rights correct, even though you know, African Americans were given the right to vote. We had a history of laws that really made it impossible for African Americans to vote. 1927 was the Nixon versus Herndon case, where Texas's white primary, which only let white people vote in primary elections, was held unconstitutional. And then in 1931, we had the white Democratic primary, so only white people could vote in the Democratic primary, which, as we know from a few slides ago, Texas was all Democrat, so basically whoever won the Democratic primary was going to be the next office holder. In 1931, the Supreme Court said that that was not constitutional. 1935, in Grovey versus Townsend, there was a practice that allowed the Democratic Party was all white. So basically saying, you know, okay, we can't have a white Democratic primary where only white Democrats are allowed to vote. We'll just have only whites are allowed in the Democratic Party, and then only Democrats can vote in the Democratic primary, which was just like the election, essentially the election. And that was found to be unconstitutional to completely exclude African Americans from party membership in 1935. In 1944, the Supreme Court held in Smith versus Allwright that you just can't have any kind of racial discrimination in the primary system. Primaries all had to be open because they were part of the election process, and you could not have any discrimination in the election process based on race. So it took us a long time to get voting rights correct for African Americans. Now, if you listen to the news of the day, you will hear a lot of discussion about the effect of different voting laws on different racial groups, and that's a whole discussion that we can have on how different voting practices, different voting or voter practices, different voting laws are discriminatory for different racial groups. But as far as the laws, we finally, you know, kind of forcibly got it right in the 1940s. In 1946, Texas was having an issue because there was a black person who wanted to go to law school. So Herman Sweat applied to UT Law School, and UT Law School did not allow black people in. And so because we had the separate but equal requirement in the United States, Texas had to say, okay, well, we're going to form a separate law school for African Americans, and it's going to be Texas Southern. And so Mr. Sweat can go to Texas Southern Law School because it's, you know, separate but equal. This is what we're doing. Whites go to UT, black people go to Texas Southern. The problem was Texas Southern in Houston, which is still there today, was established, or Texas forgot about that whole separate but equal part, that second equal part. And so Texas Southern was established, and it did not have a library. It did not have any faculty. it was just, you know, a sham of a law school, as opposed to UT, which was a good law school. So Sweat versus Painter was prosecuted. The NAACP, you know, petitioned the Supreme Court and said that Texas Southern Law School was not an equal alternative to UT Law School, and the Supreme Court agreed. So in 1970, all the schools in Texas were desegregated. We will talk a lot about school desegregation later in another lecture, but schools were desegregated in 1970, which was pretty late. And in 1980, Juneteenth was recognized as an official state holiday. So even though it was from 1865, 1980, Juneteenth was finally recognized as a holiday. So let's look at the treatment of minority groups, Latino minority groups. The American GI Forum was established in 1948, and it was founded by Hector Garcia, who was a World War II veteran and doctor. And this American GI Forum spread throughout the United States, and it helped influence the increase of Latino rights all over the country. Mr. Garcia, or Dr. Garcia, I apologize, was started because he went to war and was a doctor in the war, and then came home to discrimination in South Texas. And he saw that war heroes who were Hispanic were being buried in the Mexican part of the cemetery instead of with the white war heroes. So he started the American GI Forum, and it really, because of his efforts, really worked to increase the rights of Latinos throughout the United States. School desegregation for Latino people was in kind of a rolling time period from 1948 to 1957. In 1954, a Latino class was established, and what I put class in quotes because that is class as we think about it in constitutional law. So it's not a class as in like a second class citizen or something like that. It is a class that is allows a group to have greater protection in you know, with from the Constitution, with the courts and the laws. And what happened in 1954 was that there was a Latino man who was convicted of murder by an all-white jury. And during this time, Latinos were excluded from jury duty. So in order to say that the person who was convicted, Mr. Hernandez, had had his equal rights violated, they had to show that Mr. Hernandez was part of a protected class of people who was protected from civil rights violations. So this is where we got the Latino class that afforded Latino people greater protection from the Constitution and in civil rights throughout the United States. Okay, let's talk about the treatment of LGBTQ minority group in Texas. In 1998, Texas enacted personal relationship protection, which just meant that you could now have a private relationship in your own home without anybody criminally punishing you. So before then, if you know, you lived with somebody or you had a relationship with somebody, even though you obviously at that time could not be married, but you were still just living together as partners, it was illegal. But in 1998, that those laws were repealed, and Texas enacted the personal relationship protections. In 2015, there was a case called Overfell versus Hodges, and it held that Texas's same-sex marriage ban was illegal, was unconstitutional. So Texas had a constitutional amendment that said that marriage was between a man and a woman, and marriage between same-sex individuals was illegal, and the United States Supreme Court said that is unconstitutional.